Well, I have nothing more to say. Instead, let us turn to Ian Stevenson and see what he's got to tell us about other forms of evidence of survival.
So I'm going to talk next about experiences near death. These are the experiences reported by people who come close to death and survive. I mentioned them briefly this morning, but I'm going to narrate to you two cases that I consider rather unusual. The subject of the first case doesn't mind her name being used, and she's called Peggy, and she had an embolus. There's a clot of blood that broke off and went to her lungs just after she had given birth to a baby. And she found herself up at the ceiling looking down on a body of a woman who was on the floor of the hospital bed. And reflecting on this a bit, she discovered that it was her body. And there was then a great commotion of nurses running to and fro, and of course she was picked up and put back to bed and recovered. What was unusual about her case is that she remembered conversations between her husband, who had been hurriedly sent for, and the staff of the hospital. And she also remembered her doctor at the nurses' station, some, I would say, 75 feet away, and the doctor was just being told that Peggy had died. And he said, "Oh, that's terrible. She was such a good mother." And Peggy, after she recovered, tried to tell the doctors of the hospital about her experience. It was a hospital, as it happens, in Virginia, where I am better known than I am in Illinois. And the doctors whispered among themselves, wondering about her sanity and narrating this experience. And someone said, well, we should report her to Dr. Stevenson. They'd evidently heard about me that far south in Virginia. But they didn't do that. And it was only many years later that she reported her case to me herself. And I met her and reviewed her experience, which impressed me profoundly because of her ability to remember conversations that she could not have heard normally. Mostly, the patients who have these experiences speak about realms of which they could not have visited, heavenly realms, you might say. From their perspective, that's what they were and are. They've been there, they think, and they can't give any further details, but Peggy did. So she is, I think, an unusually memorable case. The second case I'd like to tell you about occurred to a Hungarian who was living in Switzerland, where I met and interviewed him. He had managed to escape from the Russians when they invaded Hungary, and I think it was 1956. And he got to Switzerland, where he was established himself successfully as an architect and city planner. He was taking a trip with a friend to attend a football match. It was quite some distance away, and the friend in a sports vehicle drove very rapidly. And then, to avoid a chain of oncoming army vehicles in what was obviously, or at least later obviously, a rather narrow road, he crashed. And my friend, as I may call him, Stefan, was thrown out of the car onto the pavement. And he was lying on the pavement, and the traffic, of course, halted. People got out of their cars and went over to look at the debris and at Stefan's inert body. He remembered later two of these spectators, you might say, and one of them was a man. He remembered them by listening to them from above, I should have said. One was a man who said, "Stupid fellow, reckless driver, just the type who'd get involved in a crash, didn't know what he was doing. Too bad for him." And then he walked off. The other memorable spectator was a woman who came over and looked at him and began to pray. And she had a little girl with her, and the girl was tugging and wanted to leave. And this woman said, no, we must stay and pray for him. We must pray for his soul. So she held the girl and prayed, and then they left. And somehow my friend Stefan, had learned from above the identities of these persons, their vehicles, and he was able to trace them. He traced the man and didn't say anything, just looked at him and came away. And then he traced the woman who was the owner of a small business, and the name of her business in the town where she lived in Italy was on the side of the vehicle, as many businesses have their name. And he traced her and sought her out. It was then some 5 years later, after the accident, and she introduced himself, and without giving any details, he said, "Do you remember an automobile accident of about 5 years ago?" And she said, "No, I don't remember that." Well, he said, "Don't you remember that you got out and prayed for the person who had been killed?" And she thought a little bit more and said, "Yes, that's right. I do remember that." And then he said, "I'm that man." And they both wept. That's the end of that case. I personally find it very moving, and again, it has evidence of paranormal perception. I think that's about all I need to say, or should say, about near-death experiences, except just to mention briefly the cross-cultural differences in these experiences. In the Western experiences, the person having the experience gives various reasons for returning to life, particularly the thought of children, and sometimes the thought of the husband or the wife. And there's a certain voluntariness about the wish to return that implements the return itself. That's not the case in India, not often. If you ask an Indian who's had these experiences, ask them, they say, well, I don't know how I got up there, but I was just digesting my supper and resting a little when I was snatched. And we say, what do you mean you were snatched? Well, the Yamdoots came for me and they took me to Yamraj. Well, in Indian mythology, the Yamdoots are the messengers of Yamraj, who is the king of the dead. And these Yamdoots are really thugs. They're just like bouncers in a bar. They seize the victim and force him to go. Some of the narrations by the patients are really quite disturbing. One I cited just last time I was in India, narrated being dragged through thistles and thorns on their way to the place where this case was to be reviewed. Well, then they come to the point of reviewing. Now, some of the Western subjects say that they had a sort of screen run of their life, a life review, as we call it, sometimes referred to as panoramic memory, whereas all their deeds and misdeeds flash before them. That's not the way things are done in India. They have a figure called Chitragupta, and he has a book on you, and in that book are written all your deeds and misdeeds. So, first of all, they have to identify the person they have. So Yamraj says, who have you got here? And they say, well, we brought Jadav Singh. And then Yamraj said, look him up. And then they say, well, we can't find him here. There's been a mistake. What do you mean a mistake? You bungled? Send him back. So the Yamdoots then take him back and he wakes up where he was. That's a typical Indian story. We have studied numerous cases of that kind in India. And Dr. Pasricha, whom I mentioned this morning, has studied them meticulously. And we have published some reports of them. But it's difficult sometimes for Westerners to think that beliefs can influence events in these experiences so much. But it's true nevertheless, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. Any comments or questions on that?
Yes, I recently read a book, or reread the book, Return from Tomorrow by Dr. George Ritchie, and he is in Virginia. He died in 1946, was clinically dead when he was in the military down in Texas, and he was taken supposedly by this consciousness through these different realms, and when he returned, the body was covered, and he recognized there was a hand with a ring, and that's where he went back into that particular body. And some years later, he was traveling through, I guess it was Mississippi, and he recognized the area where he had been taken, where a man had been coming out of a bar drunk. He went unconscious, and there was a supposedly disincarnate entity trying to enter into this body that was unconscious. And I was just wondering, Dr. Ritchie, I believe, is in his late 80s and still living. Are you acquainted with his story?
Yes, that's the case of Dr. George Ritchie. He is still living, I hope so. I haven't seen him for a couple of years, but that's correct. You have a good memory. And Dr. Ritchie wrote a book about his experiences, which is well worth reading. And he did indeed recognize where he was, because his body was covered, and he recognized a fraternity ring, and he thought, that's my ring, this must be my body, and he got into it.
Lucky he didn't mistake our fraternity brothers.
Maybe so.
All right, now let's restrict these especially to questions.
I'm wondering, in the case of the Indian, one of the Indian people who was dragged through the thistles and the thorns, when he came back, was there evidence of scratches on his body, or any, was there actual evidence of being dragged or experiencing some type of wound from being dragged?
Yes, the question is whether the Indian subjects have any marks on them after they come back. Yes, 2 or 3 of them have had burn marks and other signs, but that's rather rare. But there are cases like that.
I have a question about the cross-cultural differences. You said that the Indian people would get up there and then be sent back. Were there any who actually had the experience of the life review like Westerners have had?
Well, if I understand you correctly, the Indian life review is not conducted by the person himself. It's in the book. And Chitragupta has this registry in which everything that you've done and should have done or not done is recorded, including, of course, your name. And we call these cases of bureaucratic bungling, because the Yamdutes have taken the wrong person, and they have to send him back. And that's the principal motive, if you call that a motive for returning, that you hear from the Indian subjects.
Just a second, we'll get you next.
Okay.
No, Raj?
Is it on? Yes. What conclusions have you drawn from your work, Dr. Stevenson, as a result of interviewing all these children, as a result of the cases that you studied, near death and other phenomena? Have you published any conclusions associated with this work?
You mean, are you talking about all paranormal phenomena?
Yes. Yes. In other words, have you concluded that there is life after death? Have you, what kind of conclusions, what kind of outcomes would you point to that has resulted from all of the work that you've done in this area?
Well, I think there's very strong evidence that there is life after death. That's as far as I'll go. Not proof, but strong evidence.
Just a second, this won't go over there.
If belief system dictates the way the experience is relived or experience is narrated to you, that would mean that people who really don't believe anything in life after death would never experience anything.
I'm afraid I didn't understand.
She said that if belief systems model or mold the experiences one has in these near-death experiences and other such things, then someone who doesn't believe in life after death would presumably have no such experiences. Do you have any comment about that? Is there any evidence on that?
Yes, I think there is evidence in that some of these persons, perhaps most of them, would say, well, I had a vague idea there was life after death, but I wasn't much impressed by what I saw until this happened to me. And so personal experiences can be very moving.
Doctor, I was just wondering, since your approach is scientific, could you just briefly describe to us, I'm assuming because you refer to we every now and then when you are talking about your information that you gather, could you explain to us how your scientific process works? Do you take just interviews from people and then go back and interview them maybe 2 or 3 years later to see if their stories are the same, to verify your data? How is your process? How do you go about collecting this information? Could you briefly talk about that?
Yes, surely. Well, we interview as many persons as we can, provided they are first-hand witnesses. We set aside second-hand witnesses. And then we search out any relevant documents, such as post-mortem reports and death certificates. And we repeat the process of interviewing with persons who are in a position to verify what the recipient has said. For example, I interviewed Peggy Razzo's husband with regard to conversations that he had outside the door of her bedroom, questioning whether she might, while perhaps still lying on the floor of the bedroom, have heard what her husband was saying outside. They were talking. They said they were talking, and I had at one time, and I guess I still have, but I couldn't put my hands on it, a slide showing Peggy's room. It was a 2-bed room, and across the corridor there was another patient who grumbled that there was a lot of noise going on in the hospital, and that was, of course, the commotion created by Peggy's pulmonary embolus. But we interviewed Peggy's husband, and I think in that case, I looked over the, no, I didn't. I didn't go to the hospital in that case. But if there's a terrain to be inspected, I try to go there.
Okay.
Hi, Doctor. Quick question about Stefan that you had mentioned earlier. You said that he was able to trace the identities and some means of identifying who the people were that witnessed his accident. Can you go into detail a little bit as to how he was able to trace, how he was able to determine? You had mentioned that the Italian woman, he found a name on the side of the car or on the truck. But did
yes,
he?
Well, it's in southern Switzerland, and the name of the town. There's a lot of cross-border traffic in that part of Europe, and so an Italian traveling north into Switzerland would very likely have the name and the city. So they had the name of the business. Let's say in English it might be Bellini Brothers, and the city, Chicago, Illinois. And then there would be in that part of Italy only a limited number of people with that name. Stefan, I may say, he quizzed the woman a bit, and he allowed for the 5-year interval. He was really quite smart man. And he said to her first, "Do you have a daughter?" And she said, "Yes, I have a daughter." And he said, "Is she about 12? And he said, "Yes, she is 12. And of course, he was adding on the 5 years from what he remembered as a 7-year-old girl who was tugging at her mother and wanted to leave without praying. So I find that quite credible. I've forgotten what he said about tracing the man, but he was determined to confront that man, but in the end he didn't. I think he happily became overcome by charity. And he just looked at the man in the face and turned around and left without confronting the man with his ill-advised remark. I should have added that Stefan wasn't even driving the car, so there was no point in vilifying him at all. The car was being driven by his friend.
You had mentioned at one point offhandedly that you were better known in Virginia than you were in Illinois, and you had also mentioned earlier that many times people were discouraged about talking about their experiences, so perhaps there are an enormous number of experiences that are not shared, explained, or explored because of that reluctance to expose belief or suggestion in paranormal. When you finally decide to discontinue your work and let's just be done with it for now, would you be willing to suggest perhaps you've set up a team of people to continue your work, or people that might be referred to send information or to be contacted for continued progression of your studies?
Yeah, well, we have the, more than the embryo, the fetus of a team. I have a very able colleague who has succeeded me as the director of our division, and I have colleagues, I've got two somewhat younger. One is a woman, a lady, I should say, who walked into my office in 1978 and said, "Would you like a volunteer?" And I said, "Well, maybe so, and what can you do?" Anyway, to shorten the story, she came on as a research assistant. And after a while, I said, "Look, I'm not physically immortal. You ought to continue your higher education." And so with some help, she went to Edinburgh and earned a doctorate there. So she's there. And so we have, and I have Dr. Jim Tucker, who is a child psychiatrist. So there are three very able people. You call that a team? It's certainly the beginning, and they're good people.
Yes, I was wondering about continuing the research. I was just wondering if there are any organizations out there now doing that. I know in Virginia they had the ARE, Association for Research and Enlightenment. They were investigating some of the material that Edgar Cayce had given on past life, and supposedly some documentation was developed where they related previous lives to people that were living now, went to cemeteries or whatever. But I was just wondering if you're acquainted with that, sir.
Yeah, I'm acquainted with that, and I think it's a pity that Edgar Cayce wasn't investigated during his lifetime, but I don't think that's feasible now. It's too bad.
Well, we seem to have run through questions on this topic. Shall we go on to another?
Okay. So, if we follow this list, I want to talk about possession. That is a situation in which a personality seems to be dispossessed of his or her body, and a new personality emerges. These cases are extremely rare, but I have known of several of them, and I'll just mention a couple of them because they both have impressed me quite deeply. One is a case of Jasbir, a boy of northern India, who apparently died of smallpox at the age of about 3. I don't think he was more than 3. Dates in Indian villages are often uncertain, and it's hard, one would be rash to claim precision, but close enough is not more than 3. But old enough to have developed certain habits and knowledge about his situation. But he died of smallpox, as I said, in the late evening. Now in India, you're not really a full person until you're an adult. So you don't earn cremation, as I'm talking now about the Hindus, not the Muslims. Hindus cremate bodies, and they have great ghats, as they're called, or the bodies are taken and burned, usually. The father of Jasbir's uncle, the brother of Jasbir's father, said to the father, "Look, it's too late to bury him," which is what they would ordinarily do with the child. "Let's wait until it's light in the morning, and we'll bury him properly then." So the father agreed to that, but he hadn't overcome at all his grief over the death of this child, and he stood or sat all night long by the body of the child. And then in the morning, as it was dawning, he thought he saw a little movement in the boy, and then the movement developed more and more, and Jasbir became reanimated, except it wasn't Jasbir. It took him, of course, some weeks to recover fully, but when he did, he began saying that his name was Sobaram, and he belonged in Vahedi, another village. And furthermore, he was a Brahmin. He wasn't a Jat, like this family in which he found himself. And he rejected the family's food. Being a Brahmin, he was high caste. He wasn't supposed to eat the food of the low caste Jats. They would be roughly just one notch above untouchables. So what to do? The father, in desperation, engaged a kindly neighbor who cooked Brahmin food that they fed to Jasbir. And he took that and gradually developed normally as a child, except for his Brahmin attitudes. He was what we call a Brahmin snob. We say that in India. He thought himself superior to other people. And when he grew up, he still had Brahmin attitudes and wouldn't last long in jobs that would be appropriate for uneducated people. One of my associates in India succeeded in getting him a good job, so it seemed, but after a while Jasbir quit, and when last heard about, he was unemployed. On the matter of food, the family had gradually adjusted to his demands, and they were giving him food that he ate. And he was aware that it was Jat food. So in that respect, he had made an adjustment. So that's one case. The other case I studied much more recently. Jasbir was actually one of the cases I studied in the 1960s, and then with some follow-up. This case I'm now going to describe occurred much more recently and is more complicated. The subject is and was a young woman who had, I guess you'd have to say, some kind of seizures or trances in which she seemed to become possessed by, among other persons, an Indian goddess at one stage. These would just last a few days and then pass off. And then one day she said, well, I'm going to die, and predicted that X days from then she would die. And the X days passed, and she became ill, and then she became weaker and weaker, and then she ostensibly died. And they were getting ready to bury her. She would have been buried according to the Hindu customs. She would have been cremated. I said I misled you by saying they were putting her down. They put the body down of the dying person so that the person will die close to Mother India. But then later they'll take the body, when they're sure about the death, they will take the body and cremate it. But to go back to Sumitra, that's her name, they were getting ready for her funeral, you might say. And I think they had actually put her body down. At any rate, they were sure that she wasn't breathing. And then she became reanimated, and she said that her name was Shiva, not Sumitra. And she said she came from a place called Dibyapur, and she'd been killed by her in-laws. Hit over the head with a brick. She gave enough detail so that it was possible to trace a young woman called Shiva who had, according to the in-laws, committed suicide. Her body was found on the railway tracks. That's distressingly common in India, railway accidents. And then you can simulate suicide sometimes by putting a murdered body on the tracks and then alleging later that it's been run over by a train. The father of Shiva, who was a reasonably educated person, heard about Sumitra's change and went to see her, taking with him a photograph album. And Sumitra, in the personality of Shiva, then recognized all the people in the photographs. And then they took her to the place where this family lived, and here again she was able to recognize living people. Her mother, that is Shiva's mother, tried to hide in the house, and Shiva searched through the house and finally came to the presumably hidden mother and greeted her as her mother. That is a powerful case, I think, because of the wealth of detail that the changed Sumitra gave about the life of Shiva. How Shiva died, no one will probably ever know. That she was killed seems a possibility, however. When I last tried to see Sumitra, it was 1998, when Tom Schroeder was with me. Some of you might have heard of Tom Schroeder's book. He is a prominent journalist in Washington, now one of the editors of the Washington Post. And he accompanied me on 2 field trips to Lebanon and India. When we got to Sumitra's village, which, by the way, is not an easy thing to do in the first place. It's in a very remote area of northern India. Sumitra wasn't there. Dr. Pasricha, who was with me, thought that she was in the house hiding and the family didn't want to bring her out. I don't know whether that's true or not, but we were unable to see Sumitra, and so I have no full follow-up in her case.
How old was she when she died?
About 17.
Unmarried.
No, she was married and had had a child. Or I stun you all with that history? No questions? Yeah.
Did she ever return to Sumitra, or you don't know? Is that what you're saying by the follow-up?
Well, there was one account that on one day there'd been a reversal, that Sumitra had come back and then gone again. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure about that. I just don't
and in
know.
the case of the little boy, how would you qualify, what makes you qualify that as a case of possession as opposed to potentially a 3-year-old boy who, after a near-death experience, perhaps remembers a previous life and identifies with it?
Well, of course, there are similarities, but the Shiva personality was vividly different from the Sumitra that the family had known. She, in fact, rejected them at first. Then she thought, well, I ought to look after this child as Shiva's child. There's nobody to take care of him, so I'd better do that. But she rejected her husband. That is Sumitra's husband.
But in the case of the 3-year-old boy who had the smallpox and Jasbir, and you had reported that as a case of possession. But what if it was more? What makes you say possession as opposed to perhaps when he was reanimated? He perhaps had a near-death experience, and which helped him to remember a previous life, which he perhaps identified with. Instead of being possessed by an alternate identity, perhaps he just remembered a previous life and identified with it from then on. What would make the difference?
I think I need to think about that because it is somewhat difficult, but the new Jasbir, let's say Jasbir 2, refused the family's food and just rejected it.
But perhaps if his previous life he had been a Brahmin and he identified so much with this memory, he would, of course, reject it.
Yes, you're quite right. That is indeed the case. And I was just thinking about another case in northern India, not very far from where Jasbir lives, in which the subject claimed to have been a Brahmin. And he made a terrible nuisance of himself by his Brahmin snobbery. His father was a lawyer, but of the Kayas caste. And the father, very properly, I think, made notes of his child's behavior and eventually went to the other city where his child said he should be.
What time do you want to break?
So a Jasbir case might fit into that group. Yeah.
Mediumship for half an hour and dreams for half an hour, so he covers his topic.
Well, shall
We-
are we done on this topic?
We
then?
have a question from the webcast,
All right.
and this is again from Brian James from Atlanta. And he says that, I know that William Roll, R-O-L-L, professor of psychology, state at State University of West Georgia, has been cataloging a vast amount of near-death experiences. Have you had a chance to look over those, and have you seen, if you have you seen any amazing similarities or any vast differences in perspective of his work in comparison to your work?
What's the name?
William Roll.
Has he
R-O-
published? Has he published anything?
It doesn't say that he's published anything, but he's been cataloging the near-death experiences via the American Society for Cyclical Research. Cyclical.
I don't see how we can make any comparison unless we can see data. And if he hasn't published, then we've lost that opportunity. We have about 700 cases in our files, and we're gradually publishing reports about them. But you have to get something into print before it can be effectively criticized.
All right, we'll have one more question, two more questions, and then we'll take a break. The lady in red.
Thank you. I want to go back to the case of Jasmir. Did your team research the origin of the identity that Jasmir assumed, or that possessed Jasmir? He said that he was this Brahmin from another town. And did y'all research whether that person had in fact existed? And if so, what did you find? Is my question clear?
I didn't.
Were you able to, in the case of Jasmir, were you able to find out anything about the apparently possessing personality?
In Jasbir's case?
Yes.
Oh, yes. We went to the other village and interviewed Soboram's family and verified the statement that Soboram had made. He said he'd been coming back from a wedding and had fallen off a cart and apparently must have fallen head first and then died of brain injury. And everything that Jasbir said about Soboram proved to be correct.
Okay, so then in effect that would negate the possibility of Jasmir having had a near-death experience and remembered a previous life. All the evidence indicates that he actually was possessed by the personality of this other deceased person.
Well,
Yeah.
if I understand you, you're agreeing with me to bracket this under the heading of possession.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I was partly responding to the question that the other person had as to whether
I think we
it
need
might
to
have been an NDE.
move on to get it. Was there another question? One more.
Here you go. Thanks. Hi, I was going to ask a little bit more about Sumitra follow-up. Had her in-laws ever been interrogated or investigated to determine if there was any culpability? Or is it just that by virtue of the train accident, they were cleared from any responsibility for the girl's death?
Was this, you're talking about Shiva?
Shiva.
Shiva
Yes,
Sumitra, right?
Yeah, they Shiva's father brought a suit, but the family said she'd committed suicide, and Shiva's father was dissatisfied with that. And I'm not a forensic pathologist, but I must say I think it's unlikely that she committed suicide. Her body was not in any way mutilated. It just was lying on the tracks, and two trains had passed during the night. They would surely, if they'd run over her, they would have mangled her. Or even if they'd tossed her body off the front, she would have been badly mauled. So I think the father had a very good case. But of course, the law proceeds slowly, as you know, or should know. And the case was still pending. Probably is still in the Indian courts.
Indian courts are just about like ours. All right, let's take a little break now. If you all would come back in 10 minutes, we'll go on to dreams and mediumship. Thank you very much.
The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
I'm going to talk next then about mediumship and illustrate it with 2 or 3 cases that I consider valid. The first one is an exceedingly simple but I think rather telling case of it goes back to the First World War. Among the effects, now let me start over again. A letter from a soldier killed in the trenches to his family said, "Give my pearl tie pin to," and then he named a girl whom I intended to marry. And the family didn't know the girl and didn't have her address. So they were unable to do anything about a pearl tie pin. And not even that, but they didn't even know that he had a pearl tie pin. But eventually, and this came through a medium, the address of this girl was given, and the officers, he was an infantry officer, his effects had been bundled up and shipped back to his family, and they found a pearl tie pin among them, and they gave it to this hitherto unknown girl. That's a fairly typical case of mediumship in which there was a communication of a fact completely unknown to any living person, except perhaps the girlfriend. But she was not aware that her fiancé had a pearl tie pin that he intended her to have. That's, I think, a good case of mediumship in which the person believes that there has been a communication of unknown facts, facts unknown to the people concerned with the sitting. I had nothing to do with that case. I pulled that out of published reports. But I did have something to do with the next case, which is the case of Runki Runolfsson, an Icelandic person. He manifested, you might say, at mediumistic sessions through a medium called Hafsten Bjornsson, and showed himself rather a ruffian. He, first of all, wanted snuff and tobacco and alcohol, all of which were unfamiliar to the medium. And then he complained about his leg and said he wanted his leg. And the people attending the sitting knew nothing about the leg. He at first refused to give his name. I wouldn't say who he was. He said, "It doesn't matter who I am, just find my leg." And this went on for, I think, several years. And finally they said, "Well, we're not going to have anything more to do with you unless you tell us who you were and what you need." So he said, "Well, okay, I guess you have a point." So he then gave his name as Runolfur Runolfsson. And from that it was possible to look up records, old records, and identify that such a person had existed. He had been on the coast in Iceland. And now this goes back to the 1880s. And he visited with friends and drank too much. It was stormy weather, and his friends said, "You shouldn't go home in weather like this. You better wait until the storm subsides." And he said, "No, I'll be all right. Don't worry about me." And he set off, more drunk than sober, trying to reach his home in this tempestuous weather. And along the way, sat down and took swigs from a bottle that he'd brought in case of need, and probably became more intoxicated, and then went to sleep. And tidal water came in and washed his body out to sea. And then the body came back, thrown up again by the ocean, was found and given a decent burial, except for the femur, the main leg, the main bone of the leg. That was missing, and that was what the communicator wanted. He thought that he should have a full burial of his full body. And in fact, his body, they had been obliged to bury his body without the leg. So this went on for some time, and finally he said, with regard to someone who had recently joined the group of sitters, those of you not familiar with mediumship perhaps should know that the people attending a session or seance are called sitters. And this sitter group may vary in numbers. It may increase or decrease. There may be 6 or 8, or maybe just 2 or 3 persons participating. But when a particular person came and joined the sitters, then the communicator, Ruki as he became known, showed particular interest and said, "He knows where my bone is." And the sitter didn't know what he was talking about. And eventually they made further inquiries, and the carpenter who had been involved in the construction of this new sitter's new home said, "Open up this wall," indicating a wall in the house. And so they ripped off the covering of the wall and found a femur, a bone. It had obviously been chewed up by fish and perhaps by dogs on the shore. But it was the bone of a tall person, and Runke was tall. It didn't have any signature on it, but it was known that this man had been buried without his bone, and it was concluded that the bone that had been put in the wall was probably the missing femur. The story of Runke continues in a happy way, because he became mollified when his bone was duly buried with the proper ceremony, and he changed his habits. He gave up tobacco and alcohol and snuff, and he ended up, you might say, at least Hafsten Bjørnson has since died, but he ended up as the principal communicator through Hafsten. So this is a case of personality improvement in purgatory and later, probably improved through the good models provided by the sitters. That's the end of the story of Runke. Well, shall I tell one dream story?
Do you want any questions?
I didn't see any, were there?
Any questions?
Oh, sorry.
I think we weren't quite sure. We have a question over here. Just a second. We have to get electrified.
All right.
Right.
Some of the stories you gave, it was a girl that was possessed by a girl, boy was possessed by a boy. And I don't remember Edgar Casey's ever having a lifetime that he reported other than as a man. So is this always true? That you don't reincarnate as a different sex?
No, not if you accept the evidence of the cases. There are many cases of what we call the sex change type, especially in Burma, Myanmar as it's now called. One of the first cases I studied in Sri Lanka was of the sex change case, the sex change type, I mean. And she remembered the previous life of a boy who'd been a girlish boy and who talked about rebirth, as Buddhists often do, and speculated that, even expressed half-heartedly the wish that if he were to reincarnate, he would be a boy. He would be a girl. And this child, Nanatilaka, was quite boyish in her habits and attitudes. Her story isn't, her case isn't finished. I have an assistant in Sri Lanka who has got the marvelous habit of following some of these cases into adulthood. And there are stories to tell about that, but I'll just mention that Nanatilaka seemed like a model case in the clarity of her memories, but she later married a Christian clergyman who told her that this talk about rebirth was a lot of nonsense and she should give it all up. And apparently she became converted by him and, as it were, withdrew everything that she'd said as a child. But of course you can't do that if you've said something when you're 3 or 4 and somebody's made a note of it. And her case was well investigated when she was young. then you can't later say, I didn't say that. You can say, I don't believe it anymore, but you can't say, I didn't say this.
A question?
Yeah. Yes, I was wondering about the differentiation between channeling and mediumship. Are they similar? And then scientifically, I've read where they said, well, this is nothing more than multiple personality that a person has. That's how they defined it. And I was just wondering if there is a major differentiation between, because there seems to be a proliferation of channeling in our society today. Are they
Okay,
similar?
thank you. I think we've got the question.
Okay.
Yes, there does seem to be such, but the only difference that I would draw is that between those instances where some verifiable statement is made, and in most of the channeling experiences that doesn't occur.
Did you have a question?
Along those same lines, in all the forms of evidence that you have broached with us over this discussion, I'm sure you've gotten pretty expert at discerning whether something has been worth your time or whether there's a veracity to a particular person's story, whether it's through mediumship or near-death experience. And I'm sure the percentages are smaller rather than larger, that there will be a case with strong evidence that you can file and put away as documentation. Is there one form or other that is more often coming through with a larger percentage of usable cases? This might be too confusing, but...
You mean of the various kinds of evidence?
Of the various kinds, like mediumship versus possession versus near-death experience versus apparitions. What are the percentages of usable versus non-usable? Is there one that has a much greater percentage of usable cases in each?
What are the best cases? From what kind of evidence do you get the best cases? Are the ones
best
you've talked
usable
about?
cases?
I find that difficult to answer. Some of the apparitional cases are quite impressive, and so are some of the children who speak about past lives. I think I'd put those two in the lead.
What about the least? The most difficult to qualify as usable, as the opposite extreme?
Yeah.
Is there one that would come down ranking lower? More difficult to use or prove?
Well, yes, I think mediumship cases can be very tricky, and it's unusual to find a person who really is talented and is willing to submit themselves to people like myself and be investigated. Now there's a Polish engineer, Stefan Ostrowiecki, who was remarkably gifted in clairvoyance. I and two co-authors have a book coming out about him. But he's so unusual. He was killed by the Germans in 1944. And he had a beautiful character. But these people are so rare, very rare.
I have a question from our virtual audience, from Joseph Kozenzak in Chicago. And he would like to ask, have you ever attended a seance? And if so, what was your impression of it?
Yes, I've attended seances, but none that I've attended has been impressive to me. But so my conviction that some are valid and noteworthy and convey evidence of life after death rests on published reports written by people in whom I have confidence.
Okay. A couple of more questions, and then we'll need to move on to the next topic.
Yes, I'm interested in knowing if you encountered any cases where the possessing entity spoke a language entirely different from the person being possessed. either a medium or an actual case of possession.
An unlearned language?
Yes, one that they'd never known before.
Yes,
Whereas the medium would not know the language
Yeah.
that the entity was speaking.
Yes, I published several cases of that kind, but they're very rare. In one case, the language was Swedish. In the other one, in the second one, it was German, and in the third, it was Bengali. These are very difficult. They're very rare cases, and they're difficult to investigate. Yeah.
I'm just curious, in all your research, have you ever encountered any extraterrestrial whatever?
No.
Okay, thank you.
One last question, and then we'll go on to the next topic.
I'd like to go back to the femur. I find it interesting that this discarnate was so obsessed with his body in that state, and I would have thought he would have just been glad to get rid of it. And in a sense, he was still attached to his own body, even though he was on the other side. Could you comment on that?
That's true. It was, he was, I would say, abnormally attached. But I can't say I've investigated this matter thoroughly. But I do believe that more people than we realize are attached to physical features. And especially, I think, in a profoundly Christian community such as the Lutherans of Iceland are, it's very important to be fully buried entirely.
How do you get resurrected otherwise?
Well, that may have a bearing on it. Yeah.
Okay, shall we go on to dreams then?
Dreams that contain anything paranormal are frequently reported, but ones of value seem to me to be very rare. This one, or rather a series of dreams, occurred to a colleague of mine at the University of Virginia. I won't identify him further, but he had a series of dreams some years after his father's death, in which his father seemed to be coming out of his coffin and walking toward him. He had several of these dreams over a period of some weeks. He would writhe on the floor of his bedroom, and his wife would say he was on the floor partly because of some ailment in his back, but he would be ordinarily sleeping peacefully, but he was observed by his wife to be moaning and groaning and writhing and tossing around on the floor. So she asked him, what's the trouble? Why are you doing this? And he put her off and didn't say anything about the dreams. And then here I have to fill in background. This family are Christians, ultimately through Kenya. They are Roman Catholics of Goa. Those of you who remember your history of the European colonies will know that Portugal for a long time controlled Goa, which was, after independence, was taken over by India. So the letter came from the subject's sister-in-law to his wife, and she was saying in the letter, she said, what about the bones? Have you paid what's needed for the proper disposal of the bones. So this reference to bones had to do with the fact that in Goa, in the Roman Catholic Church, you had the use of the cemetery for X number of years. I think it's 3 years. And after that, your bones are dug up, and you have two choices. One is, well, you have three choices. One is to do nothing. Another is to have the bones put into a well. And the third is to have them set in the wall of the cemetery in a niche, and then you can have a tablet describing the relevant data of the deceased. And that's a treasured memorial. So, my colleague's wife had paid up for the transfer of the bones, and when this letter from her sister-in-law came, she ignored it. Meanwhile, my colleague was writhing on the floor, groaning. But when the letter came, and he could see there was some concern back in Goa about the proper burial of the body, he then told his family about his dreams and urged his wife. He didn't go himself. He probably thought he couldn't leave his work. He urged his wife to go back to India and attend to this matter. And that went on until the dreams stopped. And she had agreed to go, and the dreams ended. And that's, for me, there is some evidence of a paranormal communication from the father to the son about the matter of the bones. They were on the verge of being discarded. His wife was sure she'd paid the priest to attend to everything, including the 3-year ceremony. And the priest, in effect, was saying, no, you haven't paid everything, just send us X rupees and that'll settle the matter. So that's one of the few instances where I think paranormal information has been communicated in dreams.
Any questions about dreams? We have one in the back. And we'll come back to this one.
Doctor, has it ever been the case that someone has died and then visited a family member immediately after the expiration of that person in your research? Because it's occurred in my family, and I've heard other instances just in passing where my great-grandmother, for instance, visited my sister, and news wasn't known yet that she had actually expired. And I found that this is somewhat common, and I'm wondering if any of your research reflects or sheds light on that issue.
Well, not shedding much light, but we have certainly heard of such cases in which in fact, I mentioned this morning a case of the man called Will, who manifested to a dying woman, and none of the people around her had ever heard of Will, although Will was living in another continent and unknown to the immediate members of the dying person's family. And the interval there was just a few days when that was looked into.
Okay. We have, I think, a web question. That's fine.
Yes, to get our website, you have to go to the University of Virginia, and then you go to the, you see, I'm so technologically backward, you'd have to go to the Division of Personality Studies, which is part of the Department of Psychiatric Medicine. So you've got 3 steps to go through. But you can get there. And we have an excellent research assistant who answers the mail first, usually, and is very good.
This is a question from Alan Katzoff from Boston, and it's about how many cases of mediumship do you have on file that you or your associates have verified regarding the accuracy of the statements? And of those that were verified, what was your process of verification?
We don't have abundant files of mediumship. It's not been a major feature of our endeavors. And I don't think that I could say that I personally, I did participate to some extent in the case of Runke, but we don't have a box full, let alone a cabinet full of verified cases through mediumship. I think it's a subject that should be taken up, and I hope it will be more earnestly. In the the first half of the 20th century, mediumship was popular among investigators. But the present generation of investigators have shown little interest in it, which I think is regrettable.
I'm handicapped to have an engineering training, but what we've been talking about is one-to-one correspondence, one incarnation to one body, or one body being an opening for other incarnations. Have you ever come across where there's one body that has 2 incarnations or more? Say, I know that some multiple personalities have maybe 5 pair of glasses and they're all different. I was just wondering if you've come across that sort of thing.
No, I have come across instances in which subject, well, there may be 2 or even 3 or 4 candidates to have been the same person. This occurs particularly among the tribes in Northwest North America, such as the Tlingit. It also occurs in parts of West Africa, say among the Igbo. And they certainly pose difficulties for the investigator. The person whose life is allegedly remembered by these several persons is nearly always a notable person. And so there would be some prestige attached to verified memories of that person's life. It might be, say, a chief, or tribal leader, or otherwise notable.
Thanks. I have 2 questions. On the topic of mediumship research, are you familiar with the research of Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona, the afterlife experiments?
Yes, yes I am.
And I'm curious about your assessment of his research on mediums.
I'm disappointed in his book because he hadn't, I thought, adequately excluded alternative explanations, such as clairvoyance. I think I think he had some, or has, knowledge of some people who probably are gifted clairvoyants, but he hasn't yet, to me, and I think I could say to my colleagues, he hasn't provided evidence of animation in the communicators. I think that's a feature you'd have to, you want to look for. You don't want just an inventory of Aunt Gertrude's possessions and hobbies. You need to sense that there's some animating personality behind the communications. At least that's one of my criteria.
Yeah, thank you. And if you had unlimited funds and could design any kind of research for the future into the areas that you're interested in, what kind of research would you like to see pursued?
I guess I haven't got to her question.
She said if you had unlimited funds and could design any kind of research you would like, what kind of research would you like to design into these questions?
Well, I think I would, how much money do I have?
Unlimited.
Anyway, I think I'd pour it into the cases with birth defects and birthmarks or skin anomalies. And especially where we could obtain post-mortem reports. If I'm correct in thinking that some birthmarks derive from previous lives and some birth defects also, I think that's important information for physicians. I think medical people should know that that's a possibility as a cause of birth defects. Parents, at least in the West, are very troubled if the baby isn't normal, and they search for some explanation. One of their first questions, or one of the mother's first questions is the baby normal? And birth defects are a saddening feature of many births that should otherwise be happy. But you might be surprised to know how common birth defects are and how little is known about their causes. Some can be attributed to genetic factors, but for most, the pediatrician just has to shake his head. He doesn't know.
Thank you. I think that the majority of your work, which hasn't been what you talked about so much today, is on children who are recalling past lives. And I'm asking you, about how many cases are there now of children who are recalling past lives in which you feel that the evidence is extremely strong, that they're conveying something that they had no other way of knowing, that you were able to somehow validate because it is either from another village that you were able to go to or from something historical? But how many of these really, what you would say, the really hard cases are there?
35.
And do you have them in one place, in one chart that really describes their features? Where is the place to go for those 35?
Where are they?
Yeah.
Where are the reports on them?
Yeah.
We haven't reported all of them by any means. But my young colleague Jim Tucker, whom I mentioned and cannot sufficiently praise, is writing a paper on what we call the B cases, B case are those in which a written record was made before there was any verification. And B stands for before. And so B cases are much rarer than A cases, where the two families have met and they've mingled their memories, and it's very difficult then to know precisely what the child said because of the possibility of contamination between the families. So these B cases are precious, and they're unfortunately rare. But as I said, we have some 35 on file now, and I'm hoping that Dr. Tucker will write a paper about them.
Just ask you as a follow-up, are they mainly in India? Are they mostly in India, or are they all over?
Well, all over is a very strong phrase, but they're, well, the first one I encountered, the very first one, I showed a slide of him, Metsimad Delawar. It was from Lebanon, and I think, I think most would be from India, probably. One trouble we have is that parents become curious, and they try to solve the case. We use the word solve to mean that the child statements were verified. And they try to solve the case on their own instead of coming to us first. And that happens so often, especially in Sri Lanka. I wish I had all the time back that I spent in Sri Lanka trying to pursue children, the person about whom the child in Sri Lanka is speaking, because they're like American children to some extent. They don't give enough verifiable details. So we don't have many of these B cases in Sri Lanka. I guess one of the things Dr. Tucker will certainly describe, but I think most of them probably are from India. That we may have a few from Myanmar, and Myanmar is a great place for sex change cases, but not for the kind of B case that we would like to see more often. Thailand has interesting cases. If I still have money left, I think I'd probably do more or have more work done in Myanmar. There are fascinating cases in Myanmar of children who say they were Japanese soldiers killed during World War II. And they are loaded with Japanese traits. They grumble about the climate. They don't like the food, it's too spicy. They have a tendency to violence and are often cruel to their playmates. They slap faces of the playmates. Now, the Japanese soldiers, if they were annoyed by a villager, they would get their faces slapped. It was a Japanese discipline that's totally unknown among Burmese people. But these children I'm talking about will do this with their playmates. More money should be spent on them.
With respect to the number of cases, one might remember a saying of William James: to prove that not all crows are black, it is necessary to find only one white crow.
My original question had to do with mediumship, but as a follow-up to this last question, I believe it's in the book Old Souls by Tom Schroeder. He made reference to the fact that the number of cases in the West are very small, perhaps for cultural reasons. People don't talk about it. People, try to ignore what the child is saying. But he also said that, or if I recall correctly, he said that there were more and more cases popping up, but nobody was currently researching them. And I was wondering if, since he wrote that book, there has been somebody who has been designated to following up on Western cases in the United States.
Well, yes, that's Dr. Jim Tucker. Oh. He's doing that. I took Tom Schroeder to an American case, rather interesting case.
Described in that book.
It's actually in Virginia. We have more Virginia cases, perhaps because I'm better known there than elsewhere. I don't think there's anything in the climate of Virginia that generates cases.
But with respect to the mediumship, I was just wondering if you, in the few cases that you seem to have perhaps cataloged or have personal exposure with, did anyone discuss with the medium themselves what happens to them during a case of channeling? What happens to the medium's personality? Do they remember it? Do they notice themselves apart? Or are they watching it? Or what happens to the medium as a personality?
Well, they've been subjected to numerous inquiries of that sort. Most of them during the communications are out of touch. They're in what we would call a trance state. And they claim or state later that they don't remember anything of what went on between the lights going off and coming back on again. They're just totally amnesic for that. I can't now think of any medium who has claimed to be aware of the goings-on in the session while they were ostensibly entranced.
I have a femur question. I keep wondering, how did the femur get in the wall? I'm very curious. I'm sorry. How did the femur end up in the wall? Did someone...
The question is clear.
How did what?
How did the femur end up in the wall? From the story of the fellow who was so concerned about getting his leg buried.
It was just in the way of the builder, and he thought, we don't know who this belongs to, and we've got to get rid of it somehow. I'll just put it here, and he built it into the wall. There was nothing deliberately sacrilegious about that.
Well, we have a question here, and I also have a question. This is from a Eulalia Diaz in Miami, Florida. And she is relating an experience she had with a question at the end. I was once taking peacefully a shower at home and washing my hair with my eyes closed when a big comb I had placed on the border of the tub suddenly fell inside, making a particularly flat, loud sound, which scared me badly. I felt panic, and in fractions of a second, I felt a very loud, strong electric shock going through my spine, like a flash, accompanied by a sudden vision of being beheaded. I actually saw my head falling off and the spilling of the blood, to my horror. Never before had I thought, seen, or felt anything like this. This was the most shocking experience I've ever had, remembering something that seemed to belong to a previous incarnation, as it did not relate to anything otherwise known to me. I shall mention that in my present lifetime, I have always suffered a persistent neck pain. that has even required chiropractic treatment in that area on several occasions. Could this neck pain be traced back to a possible incarnation and beheading, according to your findings in other cases?
It could be, but that's all you could say, I think. If she had, as we sometimes have, some skin anomaly in that area, the skin area, that would be impressive. And we do have such a case. It was, the subject is one of these Japanese soldier cases that I mentioned. He was, when the British finally retook Burma at the end of the Second World War, he found himself in Rangoon. And the British occupied Rangoon in May of 1945. That was the end of the reconquest from the Japanese. So the Japanese quite often killed prisoners. They especially killed pilots, but they killed prisoners. And this subject said, he thought in the previous life, that the British would surely kill him. So instead of allowing that to happen, he committed suicide and slit his throat. And he has, and I have an illustration of him in the book, he has a remarkable scar about, I call it a scar, that's sort of jumping ahead of the facts. It's a skin anomaly right across his neck. It's about, let's say, 5 millimeters wide and maybe 20 from one side to the other.
Okay. I had a question. This isn't from the webcast, but you talked about so-called sex change cases, which of course here that has a particular connotation. But I wondered if you think that the cases that you have dealt with in this regard shed any light on homosexuality in this life.
Yes, I think they may. I think they may. But I wouldn't want to say that that's all there is to homosexuality. On the other hand, I think parents have been unjustly blamed for developing homosexuality in their children. And I've had two teenage children who asked to consult with me, and they both had been subject to what I call psychiatric abuse. That is to say, they had been exonerated, but the parents had been blamed. And the father, his life had been made miserable by the thought that somehow or other he had trained his child to be a boy. I'm sure that was wrong. These children, they didn't have any memories. They didn't claim previous lives, but they claimed that the psychiatrist had got it all wrong.
Well, I think we're about at the end of the afternoon. I want to thank, first of all, and ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Ian Stevenson for his presentation. And then we want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to close with a little quotation from the English playwright J.B. Priestley, who once remarked that all of us are living a fairy tale of our own creation. I hope yours ends with a catastrophe. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.